Part 5, navigating the waters. So here you are, you're all set up. You have trained your staff, you've hired staff, they've gone through a background check, and you have trained them and they're ready to go out. You're up and sailing. But before we get bogged down, let's make sure we are all using the same terminology. The service provider contract. This is what you get from us, and it says right at the top, the service provider contract. Payment authorization. It says authorization for purchase right at the top. But in the electronic visit verification system, the service provider contract is the authorization. Let's set sail again. How you get cell waiver clients. Clients choose their DSP from the participant choice of vendors list. The case manager will contract for services by designating the amount, frequency, and duration of services for a client on a service provider contract in accordance with the client's plan of care. But let's back up for just a second. So you have their client has chosen you as a DSP. You're going to get a telephone call or an email from a case manager saying, I have a client who lives in this approximate area. They're going to need to have a worker come this many hours a week at this time of day. And this is the kind of care this client is going to need. Do you have anybody? Because unless you have somebody, they are not going to send you a contract, because you have to initiate services within 3 working days of receiving the service provider contract from the case manager. So they're going to kind of fill out the situation via phone or email prior to sending you that contract. So let's say they felt out, yes, you've got somebody, you're ready to go. And then when you receive a new cell client, the referring case manager meets with your staff, the RN and the personal care worker and the client for the initial visit. So the 4 of you are at this initial visit. The client, the cell case manager, the RN from your RN and your personal care worker. Services should not start before the service provider contract is in place. So let's review this one more time. The case manager is going to call or email you and see if you can fill that need. If you can, they're going to go ahead and send you a service provider contract, and you will initiate services within 3 days. The first contact that you all will have with the client is when the 4 of you meet at the client's home for that initial visit. Starting services for a new client. A service authorization, AKA payment authorization, encumbers the funds allocated for the services outlined in the service provider contract. So you have that service provider contract, and you know that as far as EVV goes, that is also the authorization, but you will also receive an authorization from the case manager. And what happens when we write an authorization is those funds are encumbered. We have the money, we're putting it aside to pay you for the services that are outlined in the service provider contract. The initial contract then will be reauthorized on a quarterly basis thereafter. And so that's the authorization will be reissued quarterly. Then you must adhere to those duties that are specified on the service provider contract. If you identify personal care duties that are not on the service authorization, but probably should be, then you need to discuss that with the case manager. And if additional services identified by you or communicated to the case manager will review the client's plan of care within 3 working days of receipt of your request to change the plan of care. And you all will have a discussion about what needs to be changed and what can be changed. You must have an effective backup service provision plan in place to ensure that the client receives services as authorized. And I recognize that that is not an easy thing to do at this time, but you must have that, an effective backup service provision plan in place to ensure the client receives services as authorized. Authorization. The number of units and services provided to each client is dependent upon the individual client's needs as set forth on the client's plan of care, which is established by the case manager, by the sale case manager. The amount of time authorized in the service contract does not include work or commute time to and from the client's residence. They are not paid for their commute time. Service contracts and authorizations will be uploaded into the EVV system by the case manager. And notice that slash there, the service contract, meaning the EVV authorization, not that second authorization that you will receive from the case manager. Personal care and respite care. The unit of service will be per 15-minute increments of direct services provided in the client's residence. Personal assistance services. The unit of service will be per 15-minute increments of direct services provided as support for competitive employment. 4 units are 1 hour. The number of hours authorized per visit must be stipulated on the plan of care and in the service provider contract. Maximum service allowances for personal cares. Services cannot exceed 25 hours a week or 5 hours a day. So some examples of this would be if somebody has 10 hours per week, maybe they get 2 hours a day for 5 days a week. Maybe they get 3 hours a day for 2 days and 4 hours for a third day. So that would add up to 10. And might say on a plan not to exceed 3 hours a day. 25 hours a week generally is 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, but it could be 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, and 1 hour, 1 day, and it could say not to exceed 4 hours per day. Personal assistance. The client must work 40 hours per month, and the client's employer must agree in writing to the client having services in the workplace. That is on the cell case manager to verify work and to get the agreement from the employer. The services are based on needs and are offset by personal care hours. So if somebody is receiving personal care in the workplace, then they're not receiving those certain hours at home, so their personal care hours may be reduced. Respite care. The services cannot exceed 300 hours per year, and the services must be approved by the cell director. Our respite care is different from the respite care provided in some of the other waivers. It's not ongoing weekly. It's in case of a catastrophic event involving the participant's primary caregiver. If they have to be hospitalized or have to be away for some reason, then we can bring in a respite care worker. So it's a more intense period of time, a shorter period of time and more hours per day. Ongoing operations, nursing supervision. Personal care and personal assistant services must be provided under the supervision of the RN or LPN who is employed by the DSP. The RN must make the initial visit to the client's residence prior to the start of personal care or personal assistant services for the purpose of reviewing the services to be provided, establishing who to call if problems arise. That's who the client needs to call if problems arise, and gathering information regarding advance directives. The case manager, the sale case manager, must make this initial visit with the RN prior to the provision of services. Also at this meeting are the client and the personal care worker. So those four people must be at this initial meeting: the case manager, the client, the vendor, your RN, and your personal care worker. The LPN may make the 60-day supervisory visits. However, the RN must be immediately accessible by phone and must be physically accessible within 60 minutes from the client's home during the hours services are being provided. The supervisory visits must be submitted to the case manager within 10 calendar days after the visit. The nurse provides and documents supervision, training, and evaluation of personal care, respite care, and personal assistant services workers. They provide on-site supervision of the personal care, respite care worker, or personal assistance services worker at a minimum of every 60 days for each client at the client's residence. The supervisory visit must be documented in client records and sent to the case manager. The nurse must observe each worker with at least one client every 6 months. Note that this may be in conjunction with the required 60-day visit for each client. So you have to go out and see the client every 60 days, and not every 2 months, but every 60 days. So you need to chart that. And in doing that, you will also have to do every 6 months, you have to evaluate the worker. And you can do those in conjunction with each other. You can just schedule those at the same time. The nurse must assist workers as necessary as they provide individual services as outlined in the service provider contract and plan of care. And any supervision assistance must be documented in the client's record. Missed visits. A missed visit is when the participant is waiting for scheduled services and the services are not delivered. The DSP must have an effective backup service provision plan in place to ensure that the participant receives the services as authorized. We have already mentioned this, and again, I recognize that that is a difficult thing to do at this time. Whenever the DSP determines that services cannot be provided as authorized to an at-risk client, the case manager must be called immediately. You will know that that client is an at-risk client because it will be marked on your service contract. All missed visits must be reported in writing on a weekly missed visit report form to the cell case manager on Monday of the following week. If the supervisor does not send a substitute, the supervisor will contact the participant and inform them of the unavailability of a worker. So as soon as you know that somebody is not showing up for work and you cannot get a substitute worker out there, you must inform the client that nobody's coming immediately. Whenever 2 consecutive attempted visits occur, the case manager will be notified. An attempted visit is when the personal care worker, respite care worker, personal assistant services worker arrives as scheduled at the residence and is unable to provide services because the client is not at home or refuses services, DSP cannot bill for attempted visits. Required notifications. The DSP will notify the case manager within 3 working days of the following client changes. If the client's condition has changed, if the services that are on the contract no longer meet the client's needs, if the client dies or moves out of the service area, if the client no longer wishes to participate in a program of personal care services, or if you have knowledge of a client's Medicaid ineligibility or potential ineligibility. The case manager will notify DSP immediately if a client becomes medically or financially ineligible for waiver services and issue a service provider contract terminating services. The case manager must verify Medicaid eligibility on a monthly basis. Right now, during the pandemic, it is September 2021, no one will be dropped from a waiver program because they have become financially or medically ineligible for services. Generally, that is the rule, but at this moment during the emergency order, it is not. Rights, responsibilities, and complaints. You will inform participants of their right to complain about the quality of personal care, respite care, and personal assistance services, and will provide participants with information about how to register a complaint. Complaints that are made against workers will be assessed for appropriateness, investigated by the DSP, and documented in the client's file, the worker's file, and the complaint log. All complaints documented in those 3 places: client's file, worker's file, and complaint log. All complaints and follow-ups by the RN or LPN supervisor shall be documented, and appropriate action must be taken. The DSP must maintain a complaint log, including documentation of all complaints, outcomes, and follow-ups. There should be a separate complaint log for the sale waiver because you don't want to share our information with any other operating agency, and certainly we do not have the right to see the information from any of them. Again, with the complaints, all complaints against a worker will be referred to the worker's supervisor, who will take appropriate action. The supervisor will document the action taken in both the client's and the employee's file. The supervisor will contact the case manager by letter, email, or telephone about any complaint and the corrective action taken. This contact will also be documented in the client file. The DSP must maintain a complaint log identifying the date and time the complaint was made and to whom, the client, the worker, the nature of the complaint, and resolution to show that they have complied with the requirements of this section. Duplicate information must be placed in the client file as well as the worker's personnel file. Mandatory reporting. The Alabama Protective Services Act of 1976 addresses abuse, neglect, and exploitation of adults who are incapable of protecting themselves and have no one willing or able to protect them. If you are a practitioner of the healing arts or a caregiver, you are required by law to report any form of suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation of an adult who is physically or mentally incapable of adequately caring for his or herself. Long-term care ombudsmen are also mandated reporters. Really, any of us looking at this PowerPoint slide are mandatory reporters. Mandated reporters must be must report immediately after finding a reasonable cause to believe or suspect that an adult in need of protection has been subjected to any form of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Reports may be made orally, by telephone, or in person. It should be followed by a written report. And that written report is submitted to the case manager. Mandatory reporting. We are a mandatory reporter. Everyone who works for SAIL, everybody who works for you, we're all mandatory reporters. So SAIL wants the following reported. You report abuse, physical, sexual, verbal, exploitation, mistreatment, neglect, fall, fire, injury, moderate or major, death, natural or unnatural. Report all of that to SAIL. DHR requires that you report abuse, physical, sexual, verbal, exploitation, mistreatment, or neglect. And that is a DHR reporting number, 1-800-458-7214. That is who you report to for DHR. And that is what you report to DHR. On the left side of the screen, that is what you report to the SAIL case manager. Client files. You will maintain a case file on each waiver participant receiving services and establish a client profile in support of units of services delivered based on the service provider contract. The file will contain initial visit and all supervisory visits, documentation of the responsible person. If the client is not physically able to sign, then the worker must document why the log was not signed by a client or a responsible person. Service contracts will be in there, service logs, all medical and other participant information. All information will be kept confidential and shared only with persons authorized by DSP to use such information for the participant's rehabilitation and developmental purposes. You will retain a client file for at least 5 years after services are terminated. Billing and reimbursement. Oh, I think you might get quite enough of this for one day. This is our billing sheet. Goes 1 through 31 with a total of units, any comments you have for each of those days, the client name at the top, your name, the month, the year, the invoice number, and then you're signing off that this is accurate. So SAIL may terminate your contract or your memorandum of agreement at any time before the date of expiration whenever it determines that the DSP has failed to comply with the terms of its MOA. And you may terminate your MOA by providing a 30-day written notice to SAIL. Renewal of the MOA, same paperwork every 3 years, but you have it all under control. And if you have any questions, please call me. I'm Lillian Butler, and I'm at 334-293-7349.